Strangely enough, to answer that question, we have to go all the way back to the Crusades. Now, if you recall, the Crusades began because the territory of the Abbasids, which included the Holy Land, was eventually basically taken over, not officially, but basically taken over by a new people called the Seljuk Turks, devout Sunni Muslims who basically defended the Abbasid Caliphate against the rival Fatimid Caliphate of Egypt, the Seljuk Turks, who were excellent fighters. One problem with the Seljuk Turks is that they basically took over Jerusalem in 1070 AD and killed a lot of the Christian inhabitants of Jerusalem and also prevented further pilgrimages. Then they also whooped the Byzantine Empire in 1071 AD at the Battle of Manzikert, and the Byzantine Empire needed help, and they had no one to go to but the Pope in Rome. So in 1095 AD, Pope Urban II called the Counts of Clermont and basically appealed to the kingdoms of Western Europe to do something about the Seljuk Turks to help their Byzantine brethren in the Far East and also to liberate the Holy Land and make it safe for pilgrims to go there. The problem was that in the meantime, the Fatimids had taken over the Holy Land, and they were a lot nicer to the Christians of Jerusalem, but nobody told Europe, and so it was a war against the Seljuk Turks, even though the Seljuk Turks no longer had Jerusalem by that point. Nevertheless, this started a mass movement. Basically, thousands and thousands of people gathered together and made the journey from the kingdoms of Europe down to Constantinople, where they stayed for a while and basically enjoyed the hospitality of the Byzantine emperor, and then finally got around to going into Anatolia, and amazingly, after several hardships crossing the Anatolia, where a lot of them were slaughtered or died of hunger, thirst, or disease, or overheating, eventually made it to Jerusalem. Thus, in 1099 AD, the Christians' armies made it to Jerusalem. You can see them here besieging the city. Here you can see a catapult or a trebuchet, and the various things are all climbing up the ladders. They besieged the city and took it over with great slaughter and massacre. Even they mention this in their Christian sources, not just the Muslim sources that mention this, but the Christian sources mention how much bloodshed there was at the siege of Jerusalem in 1099. You can see one image here. Here's another picture, another contemporary picture. You can see very clearly the Christian soldiers, mostly Normans, mostly Frankish Normans. We talked about Normans, the former Vikings that settled in France. Here's Peter the Hermit, one of the great leaders of the First Crusade, and here are your Muslim warriors, mainly Fatimid Muslims from Egypt, fighting in this particular part of the Crusades. And here is a more contemporary image that gives you an idea of the feeling of liberation that the Christians felt. You also notice the crosses. That's going to be a big deal. The crosses that they wear, because the whole reason they're called crusades is because these people would literally take up the cross, and they would do it in return for an indulgence. This was the original indulgence, by the way. To get an indulgence, you had to actually go on a crusade and fight for the Holy Land. Today you just pray a rosary, but that's what it was originally. Now, great, now they got Jerusalem. Now it was theoretically safe for pilgrims, but now they had to stay, and staying was the hard part. Eventually, in the process of the First Crusade, the Christians established 4 Latin kingdoms. That's what they're called, the 4 Latin Crusader kingdoms. The County of Edessa, the Principality of Antioch, which is actually the first one. It was run by the Normans from southern Italy. The County of Tripoli, and the kingdom itself of Jerusalem. One thing I should point out, too, is notice here Acre, which is going to become one of the major cities in the Kingdom of Jerusalem, the major defense for the Christians. Now, settling down these 4 kingdoms was fine, but then there was a problem in the fact that they're surrounded by enemies. Over here you have the Sunni Great Seljuk Empire. For a while, actually, Christians are relatively safe from this area because the Seljuks do not unite. Their main enemy is going to be the Assassins, but we don't have time to talk about that. Down here you have the Fatimid Caliphate, which is zealously Shiite, the enemy of both the Seljuk Turks and the Christians. So you basically have these coastal kingdoms, these small strip of land of Christians surrounded by enemies. And as we all know, in that part of the world, peace does not come very easily in such a situation. There's going to be a lot of strife between these 4 kingdoms and the area around them. There is some trade, by the way. They do end up having some amicable relations. For example, Venice and Genoa, as we talked about before, profit much from this because they get to send their ships to supply their Europeans with the things that they're used to, but then they also get to take stuff that the Seljuks have bought all the way from India and China even, and bring it back to Europe, and that's how Europe starts to get hooked on spices. Um, Nevertheless, the main thing is there's going to need to be some sort of protection for people because this is dangerous territory. The solution to this problem of defending Christians who were living or visiting the Holy Land in these kingdoms was the rise of the military orders. These were actual religious orders, that is, men who take vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience, just like other religious orders, but they added to it the defense of pilgrims. So basically, poverty, chastity, and obedience, and the defense of pilgrims. That was the idea originally, and it basically maintained that. But the end result was that you had basically these men who were became elite fighting forces. Really, the most important two, and definitely the best two, were the Knights Templar. Here's their symbol right here, the red cross on a white background, which basically imitates the Crusader cross. And they were first. They were founded in the year 1118. We could talk about them more maybe some other time, but they got a very interesting history. The other one was the Knights Hospitaller, which is a white cross on a black background at first, although later, as you can see here, it became a white cross on a red background, but especially with this Maltese cross with the little indentations in it right here. That's a typical Knights Hospitaller. They were founded actually a little bit earlier in 1113, although they didn't become military until after the Knights Templar figured out this whole military thing. So that's when their hospital was founded. The Knights Templar were so called because they were founded at the Al-Aqsa Mosque, which the Christians called the Temple of Solomon. Here you see the Temple Mount in Jerusalem. You all recognize perhaps the Dome of the Rock. That's what the Christians called the Temple of the Lord. But across from it is the Al-Aqsa Mosque. When the Christians took it over, they called it the Temple of Solomon, and that's where the Knights Templar started. That's why they're called the Knights Templar. The Knights Hospitaller were founded in the Hospital of St. John, which has actually been there for centuries, but they took it over in 1113 AD from the Benedictines. So you have the Knights Hospitaller of St. John and the Knights Templar. They were the two most important. The hospital itself that the Knights of St. John ran is a hospital in two senses. One in the way we're used to, that is, it literally was a place to take care of the sick. As a matter of fact, the Knights Hospitaller were also elite doctors for their time, and that's still true. The Knights Hospitaller still exist, but today they're the Knights of Malta, and the Knights of Malta are known for their humanitarian aid in various parts of the world, and basically trying to bring medical supplies to various parts of the world. They don't fight anymore, even though they still exist. Celia's dad, if you recall, she mentioned that her dad is a Knight of Malta. But the other definition of hospital at this time is literally a place of hospitality, a place where pilgrims can stay when they come to visit the Holy Land. And of course, that makes sense that you would want to have defenders, because it's literally a place for innocent and unprotected pilgrims to stay. So that was kind of the idea of the Knights Hospitaller. This situation worked out fine for a while. Those two orders were enough, and the Hospital of St. John was enough. But eventually, German-speaking pilgrims who came to the Holy Land felt that their needs were not being adequately met. So in 1143 BC or AD, there was founded the Teutonic Hospital of Jerusalem. Not yet a military order, just a hospital, hospice, so to speak. This hospital, the word Teutonic just means German speaking. It's the same root word as Deutsch, as in Sprechen Sie Deutsch. And according to Tacitus, the Roman author, it comes from the German god Twisto that the ancient Germans used to worship. But you get the idea. If you hear the word Teutonic, that just means German. And here is a picture right here. Let me just get rid of this real quick. Of the original hospital where it is in today. Its ruins in Jerusalem. This is the German-speaking hospital as it is now. Now, eventually, the German hospital had to leave Jerusalem because Saladin eventually comes over and overtakes Jerusalem. The Christians lose Jerusalem itself, but their kingdom doesn't. Basically, the capital of the Christian kingdom goes to Acre. So the German hospital as well moves to Acre. Here's a picture of Acre. There, it's a coastal town, and that works well for the Christians because they can get their much-needed supplies from Europe. The Germans are no different. The German hospital moves to Acre, and that's where it becomes military. In the year 1198 AD, it becomes the Teutonic Order, another military order, An order of German-speaking nobles open to them only take vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience, and also fighting. The difference is that these are all German. Here is their symbol. It's kind of the reverse of the Knights of Malta, the Knights Hospitaller. A black cross on a white background. That's going to designate them. And here's an actual Teutonic Knight in his garb. Notice the helm. The one thing the Teutonic Knights are known for is their flashy ceremonial helms, with usually either horns or even wings on the side. So, Teutonic Order. Unfortunately, the timing was bad. The Christian presence and power in the Middle East was waning. This was mostly due to the efforts of Saladin, the Kurdish general who managed to do pretty much the impossible: unite the Muslim forces of both Syria, Seljuk Turks, and Egypt, the Fatimid Caliphate, thus forming what was called the Ayyubid Sultanate. That was because he was the son of Ayyub. He was Saladin ibn al-Ayyub, and he founded what's called the Ayyubid dynasty. You can even see it here in German, Reich der Ayyubiden, the Ayyubids. Saladin basically won several battles against the Christians, and the Christians would never recover. From then on, the kingdoms got smaller and smaller. They already lost Jerusalem. Thus, the Teutonic Knights wanted another job. They were failing in the Crusades. So Hermann von Salza, this is him right here, asked to commute his vow, basically, the vows of the knights, the Teutonic Knights in general. Remember, crusading involved a vow. It was basically a vow to fight for Christ. But he basically wanted to go to another place, some other place to do a crusade. For instance, there were crusades. By this point, the crusades were a popular thing all over Europe. There were plenty of infidels in Europe to fight. So, for example, there were crusades in Spain to regain Spain for Christianity. There were crusades in France against the Albigensians, the Cathars. There were crusades in all various kinds of places, and the Teutonic Knights wanted to get out of the Holy Land. At first, they were invited by the King of Hungary to come help out over there, so Hermann von Salza brought the Teutonic Knights there in order to fight the Kipchaks at their southeastern border. However, the King of Hungary immediately noticed that the Teutonic Knights seemed to want land. They wanted to actually find a place to settle down and kind of run their own fief, so to speak. So he kicked them out, so they really had no place to go. Finally, they turned to the most powerful Holy Roman Emperor in history, Frederick II Hohenstaufen, the height of the Holy Roman Empire. You can even see that right here, how big the Holy Roman Empire was at his time. He's basically got the normal Central European area. He's also got southern Italy. He inherited southern Italy through his Norman mother. His mother was a Norman. Also the islands, the Norman southern Italy controlled the islands of the Mediterranean. You can see that basically they've surrounded the Pope. The Pope is still there. You can see this slight purple right here. That's the Papal States, but he was extremely powerful. He was also a very strange character. He was called the Stupor Mundi, the wonder of the world. That's mainly because no one had categories for him. He was an atheist and was a very impious person in general. You might remember him because he was the one who founded the University of Naples. He granted the Teutonic Knights a place to fight the infidel, Prussia, to basically go there, establish themselves there, and try to win over the Old Prussians, the Slavic tribe, the Balto-Slavic tribe called the Old Prussians, and also the Lithuanians, the Old Prussians, the Livonians, and Lithuanians, to basically fight against them as a crusade. People had tried before, but no one had succeeded in either converting them or in beating them back. That's where the Teutonic Knights went. Now, interestingly enough, before we move on with that, I should mention that in the year 1291, this, by the way, this all happened in the year 1226. In the year 1291, the Crusades finally ended altogether. As you can see right here at the Siege of Acre, so this was down at Acre, the Mamluk Sultans of Egypt, who had taken over from the Ayyubids, attacked Acre, and the knights there made a great last defense, but eventually the Mamluks won, and that was the end of the Crusader presence in the Holy Land. That was in 1291. I bring it up, though, because in this painting you can actually see some Teutonic Knights. You see a Teutonic Knight right here. You can see their flag right here. You also see some Knights Hospitaller right here with their later red mantle. They fought bravely, but now they have no place. They're done in the Holy Land. Teutonic Knights already have another place to go. They can go to Prussia. The Knights Hospitaller eventually went to Rhodes, as you know, until the 1500s when they were kicked out of Rhodes by Suleiman the Magnificent when they moved to Malta, thus becoming what would later be the Knights of Malta. As for the Knights Templar, they really never found a home. They had plenty of land in Europe, but no one state home. The Teutonic Knights will have their own state, and so will the Knights of Malta. Knights Templar, not so much, and as we can't go into their history now, but eventually they get destroyed completely by the King of France. But getting back to Frederick II in the Holy Roman Empire, as I mentioned, it was in 1226 that Frederick II issued what was called the Golden Bull of Rimini. This bull gave the Teutonic Knights the permission to crusade in the area that we now today call Prussia, but it also gave them the permission to form their own state there. It formed a literal monastic state. That is a state run by monks, a monastic state. That's what they call it. As a matter of fact, in German they called it the Ordenstaat. Sometimes we call it the Teutonic state. That is, this wasn't only an area of operation, it was literally a state that belonged to the Teutonic Knights. It was confirmed, by the way, by the Pope in 1230. The Pope also confirmed this as a way to commute the Teutonic Knights' vow, since they couldn't work in the Holy Land anymore. Since this was a favor for the Holy Roman Empire, Frederick also gave the Teutonic Knights the permission to use the Holy Roman Empire's imperial eagle in their new standards. So now their standard was the shield with the black cross on a white field with the Holy Roman Empire imperial eagle in the center. And again, this seal is the seal of the Master General of the Order. He was an abbot, so he's got the abbatial mitre, but then also a crozier to signify spiritual power, but also a sword to signify their deputation to fighting for Christendom. I should also mention that Frederick II was the first one to put two heads on his own imperial eagle, which will become a symbol now of the Holy Roman Empire. He put two heads on it because the head symbolized the power of the state and the power of the church. It was a way of Frederick II trying to make the point, like the Byzantine emperors of old, who also used a two-headed eagle, that they ran both church and state. He was trying to basically snub the Pope by putting two heads on the eagle, but now it will stick. It becomes a symbol of the Holy Roman Empire and the Austrian Habsburgs later. This state, as you can see it right here, this Teutonic state, its capital was Malbork or Marienburg. Here's a picture of their castle, the castle they built there. The Teutonic Knights were known for their state-of-the-art castles. They were very good at building castles. This was their castle at Malbork. And from there, they began fighting. They began fighting against the old Prussians, against the Lithuanians, and against the Livonians, trying to win back, basically to win these people over Christianity. It wasn't very successful at first in terms of conversions, but they did conquer new land. Eventually, they also merged with another military order, the Livonian Sword Brethren. They also had the commission to basically try to conquer the Livonians. They failed. They didn't do a very good job. So eventually they were merged with the Teutonic Knights. So not only this was part of the Teutonic state, but eventually all this will be joined the Teutonic state when the Livonian Sword Brethren, whose seal is right here, will join with the Teutonic state. From their new base given to them by Frederick II, the Teutonic Knights immediately began doing battle with the forces of paganism, the old Prussians, the Livonians, and the Lithuanians. They became quite the elite fighting force. It was almost as if the cold environment of the north really brought the best out of them, unlike the desert environment of the Holy Land. From their new base, they immediately began spreading all over the area around Prussia and further. So, for example, you can see right here their basic progress, moving up north, eventually connecting with the Livonian Sword Brethren up here, and forming one large Teutonic state that not only involved Prussia, but also the area of modern-day Latvia, Lithuania, and Estonia. However, as you can also see, all these little red dots represent rebellions. They were quite resisted. No one seemed to like them. Conversions were slow. So one thing that they did was they kept asking for Germans from the Holy Roman Empire to come and go ahead and live in the Teutonic state. It was basically an open invitation for German nobles. For example, think of second sons who want a new place to go, for Germans to come and live, German speakers to come and live in the Teutonic state. And that's part of the reason you have a Germanophonic population in this area. But again, as I said, they're quite opposed by especially the Lithuanians. The Lithuanians don't really like them. The Polish don't like them. The Polish are Christian, but the Polish find them very annoying. And also the the Livonians. Yeah, some of the Livonians. And also the Russians. There's a lot of people that don't really like the presence of the Teutonic Knights. However, they would all have to unite forces soon because a worse danger was coming. For starting in the 1230s AD, the Mongol hordes arrived in Europe. Just an explanation before I color it in. Here you have the Teutonic Knights, these two number 4s here. The Russian principalities, remember, they color it one color, but it's principalities. These are the various Russian principalities. Kiev is over here somewhere. Novgorod's up there somewhere. Moscow's over there somewhere. Basically, the Mongols suddenly came on, and they came on hard, and they came on strong. They just completely came out of the east and invaded Hungary first, and as I mentioned before, they wiped out 40% of its population. They subjected all the Russian principalities to their yoke and made many incursions into the area of the Teutonic Knights and Poland. Because of this, in the year, what was their secret? Let's talk about their secret first. They were a Far Eastern people who had been united by a genius named Temujin in the late 12th and early 13th century. He was thus known, because of what he did, as Genghis Khan, the universal ruler. Genghis Khan and his sons after him quickly expanded the Mongol Empire to become the largest contiguous empire in world history. They did this by using lightning-fast cavalry, a majority of archers, as you can see right here, some archers. Here's their lightning-fast cavalry, and in a modern movie's depiction. Plenty of siege weaponry, you can see that right here, siege weaponry, and also a tactic of terror wherever they went. They also, by the way, used silk shirts that arrows would pierce, but it was easy to take the arrows back out again, which is one of the worst part about arrows, is the barb of the arrowhead afterwards, pulling out of your skin. They just pulled on the, they would just pull on the silk and it would remove the arrow. They also lived in yurts, just have to mention that, because I like yurts. Their empire stretched all the way from Hungary and Poland to the Pacific Ocean. Now, in the year 1241, they were such a threat that the Poles and the Teutonic Knights forgot their old enmity and united against the Mongols. You can see that here in this image. Here you have the Mongol hordes right here, and here you have a coalition of Poles and Teutonic Knights. You can see the Teutonic Knights' eagle right here. And they tried to unite forces. It would be the only time, really, that the Teutonic Knights would be well appreciated by the Poles and the Russians, Lithuanians. You can see some other coats of arms here, various Polish families. Unfortunately, the coalition failed. In 1241, they lost that battle. Things were looking bad for Christendom. Oh, here's another image, another artist's conception, again, of the Mongols fighting the Teutonic Knights. Things looked bad, but then in the year 1242, the current Mongol Khan, Ogedei Khan, as I mentioned before when we talk about Russia, Ogedei Khan died, and when he died, the Mongols basically all left. They still kept Russia, but Europe, they were gone. The Mongols left, and they really never invaded Europe again. So really it was just a stroke of luck. Who knows what would have happened if the Khan didn't die that year. They never invaded Europe again. So for now, the Mongol threat was over. Unfortunately, what that means is, as soon as the Mongols are out of the way, the Teutonic Knights fall back into enmity with all their neighboring countries. For example, in that very same year, they tried to expand into Russian territory, particularly the Principality of Novgorod. The Russians would not have this, however. So, a person I've mentioned before, Alexander Nevsky, one of the heroes of Russian nationalism, this is him right here, Alexander Nevsky, the Prince of Novgorod, who was, by the way, the one who decided to cooperate with the Mongol hordes. He decided to basically make enemies of the West and make friends with the East. So Alexander Nevsky basically, just give me a second, Nevsky basically paid off the Mongols, but when it comes to the Teutonic Knights, he went to war. He attacked the Teutonic Knights to get them to stop expanding eastward. He attacked the Knights at the Battle of, and I'll show it right here, just give me a second, let's move him down. The Battle of this lake right here, this really large lake that's on the border of the Teutonic Order in Russia. The Battle of Lake Peipus, you can see it right here. Just give me 1 second. The Battle of Lake Peipus, sometimes also called the Battle on the Ice, because it was fought literally on the frozen Lake Peipus. In this battle, the Russians won. Just give me 1 second here. The Battle of Lake Peipus, also in 1242. The Russians won, and basically what this meant was the Russians stopped the advance of the Teutonic Knights. It stopped the eastward expansion of the Teutonic Knights. So from now, there's not going to be any more troubles with Russia. The Teutonic Knights are going to stop that direction.